Without wasting any more of your time, up next is a journalist on the Sun-Times Metro desk. She's a magnificent woman who will be sharing a personal story about the man who planted the seeds of her family's deep-rooted devotion to the Chicago Cubs, her father. And although I'm a Sox fan, I am so thankful for her words because it was my late father that planted the seeds of my devotion to the Southsiders. So please give a warm welcome to Rummana Hussain.
So one of my earliest and most happiest memories is when I was 2 years old, looking out the window from my family's first apartment in Lakeview as my father was coming home from his job at Illinois Masonic Hospital. I know it sounds insane that I could have memories at 2 years old, but I vividly remember seeing my father in his suit and glasses waving to me as I was bouncing up and down in my crib. Illinois Masonic Hospital is where my father first started working after he immigrated from India a few years earlier. About a few years after he came, my mom came about a year later with my older sister and herself. And I was born at Illinois Masonic a few years later. My siblings ended up being born at the same hospital a few years after that. Now, a few blocks away from Illinois Masonic Hospital is a place called Wrigley Field, home of the Chicago Cubs, as many of you guys may know. At the time, my parents were living in Lakeview, and me and my older sister were living with my parents. They had no idea that who the Chicago Cubs were, or even what baseball was. They were trying to start their new life as an immigrant family, and me and my older sister were too little to know who the Chicago Cubs were. Flash forward to 1984, the Cubs are having a stellar year. They win the Eastern Division Championship. Everybody around us, all our peers, are all excited. At this point, we're living in Lincolnwood, which is a suburb right outside Chicago. It's a northern suburb, so there's a lot of people who are huge, huge Cub fans. And this is the same time my brother and I ended up getting Cubs fever. And we just started watching the games after that 1984 season whenever we could, especially my brother. Now, my father wasn't too excited about our fandom for the Chicago Cubs. He would watch the games, and he would be like any immigrant dad and say to us, "You guys should be studying or reading a book so you can improve your grades." And we would just kind of, blow him off and keep watching the game. And he would tell us, "Listen, I've been in Chicago since 1969, and the Cubs have been lousy ever since I've come to the United States." I didn't have the heart to tell him that they hadn't won the World Series since 1908. So for the next few years, my brother was a bigger fan, but I would be kind of watching the Cubs from watching the scores, seeing how they were doing. And obviously they had a lot of dismal seasons, but then 2003 came along. At this point, my older sister has 2 children, and the Cubs have a pretty stellar year again. And me, my brother, and my younger sister took my niece, my oldest niece, who then was 9 years old, and we went to the infamous game, which is now known as, sadly, as the Bartman game. We ended up going to the game, and the Cubs collapsed. We came home, and I remember my dad making fun of us. We're all adults at this point, and my dad called us a bunch of losers. He said, "You're a bunch of losers cheering for a loser team that's never going to win the World Series." Of course, a few years go by after that. 13 years later, the Cubs are in the World Series. I think that's 13 years later, 2016, the Cubs are in the World Series. My father is no longer with us, but the Cubs win, kind of astonishing all of us, especially Cub fans who've been watching the Cubs forever. And it was such an emotional moment for a lot of people. A lot of individuals, including my husband, were thinking about their grandparents and their parents just waiting for that moment in history to finally happen. My father is no longer with us, and I was just so excited, but I also started feeling sad and started thinking about my dad and how he would make fun of us and berate us for watching the Cubs. And I kept thinking, I bet if he was alive, he would be watching the Chicago Cubs with us. Because in 2005, when the White Sox, the other Chicago team that me and my siblings don't really cheer for, when they were in the World Series, my father had been diagnosed with cancer in October of 2005, and that's when the Sox were in the World Series. And my father actually had been watching from his bed while he was sick the entire series. And I got to watch 1 or 2 games with him. In fact, I think I watched the game when the White Sox clinched. And he was actually very happy, he had a smile on his face, but the rest of us were kind of sad because we knew he was pretty sick. So I do like to think that if he was alive today and saw the Cubs, he would probably say, finally, they're not losers anymore. And he would tell us that we weren't wasting our time too much. My dad probably thinks that he really didn't do anything or didn't really influence our decision to become Chicago Cubs fans, but he did. We always ask my father how he ended up in Chicago. And he comes from a poor village. He was the only one in his family who got educated. And he was part of the Asian brain drain of the 1960s and 1970s. And he told us that he basically got 2 offers from 2 hospitals in the United States. One was from Chicago, Illinois Masonic, and the other one was for a hospital in Florida. And we always asked him, why didn't you choose to go live in Florida? And he said, I didn't know anything about either place. I just knew that Chicago was paying me more money. And that's how my family ended up coming to Chicago. So I always look back and I think about my father and how the values that my parents instilled in us, loyalty and staying loyal in the face of adversity, helped us become Cub fans. And I think about the fact that if my father didn't come to Chicago, none of us would look at Chicago and think of as comfort and familiarity. As my mother always says, when she goes overseas, even when she's visiting her siblings in India and other relatives, when she's flying back into O'Hare and she looks at the skyline, the first thing she thinks is when she sees the Sears Tower and the John Hancock building, I'm home. Thank you.